Hello, Michael. How are you? We have just started the live stream.
Okay.
All right. Just let me get the controls right. Hello, Michael. How are you?
Life has been kind, Rabia. How are you?
I'm great. I'm great. Things are great. All right. So with this, we will begin our conversation and we'll let our attendees join in. And we have just live streamed this. We are going to see how many people join us there as well. Before I begin, I would like to introduce you, Michael, to a larger audience who, those who are interested in the subject. You definitely need no introduction in South Asia or to a South Asian audience. But for those who are joining us from other disciplines and have no idea about arms control, but are still interested in broader South Asian security issues, I would like to introduce you. Michael Krepon co-founded the Stimson Center in 1989. He served as Stimson's president and CEO until 2000. He was appointed the University of Virginia's Diplomat Scholar, where he taught from 2001 to 2010 while working at Stimson. He is the author and editor of 22 books, most recently Off-Ramps from Confrontation in Southern Asia and The Lure and Pitfalls of MIRVs from the First to the Second Nuclear Age. His new book, Winning and Losing the Nuclear Peace, The Rise, Demise, and Revival of Arms Control, is published by Stanford University Press, and it came out late last year. He has worked previously in the executive branch on the Capitol Hill, and he has received the Carnegie Endowment's Award for a Lifetime Achievement in Non-Governmental Work to Reduce Nuclear Dangers in 2015. With this, I would like to welcome you formally to this conversation with CSSPR on your new book and on the future of arms control. So on behalf of the School of Integrated Social Sciences and CSSPR University of Lahore, thank you so much for giving us time to join us today this evening, Michael.
Rabia, you've done amazing work at the University of Lahore. I'm not surprised. Your intelligence and industriousness is very familiar to me, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much. You're very kind and generous. I've learned a lot from you over the years that we have interacted, and thank you so much for your great inputs and guidance that has directed my work over the years. With this, let us begin. I would like you to take 10 minutes and tell us about what's your new book about, what's the thesis, and then I have a couple of questions for you to direct this conversation, and then we'll take some comments from our audience as well. So with this, over to you.
Thank you, Rabia. And hello to friends and colleagues in Pakistan. I miss our personal interaction. It's been a long time. I miss visiting the region. And I've learned so much from the region. What I want to convey to you now is that darkness is followed by dawn. And occasionally dawn is followed by darkness. The practice of nuclear arms control was so difficult for the United States. And it's going to be, and already is, extremely difficult for Pakistan and for other states that feel the need to have nuclear weapons. But in the United States, as a result of very hard work by generations, and despite severe setbacks, the practice of nuclear arms control took hold. And it was remarkably successful. By the end of the Cold War, all of the key elements for nuclear peace were in place. And nobody expected this when people first started to do this work. It was impossible, but the impossible happened. And the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to open lines of communication that were desperately needed in times of crisis. And then following up on that, they agreed to stop the most dangerous practices associated with nuclear testing in the atmosphere, an extreme public health hazard. And yet we did it. The Soviets did it. The British and the French and the Chinese did it. And then we began to try to place limits on our strategic forces. Those limits were so porous to begin with. And there were more setbacks, but eventually we got to the place where we actually achieved reductions in nuclear forces, stopped testing nuclear weapons, which was crucial because every test of a nuclear weapon was a declaration of military utility. We agreed to codes of conduct that were crucial. We didn't entirely eliminate, but we reduced dangerous military practices. We accepted borders. We accepted national sovereignty and the territorial integrity of states, and we agreed they should not be changed by force of arms. We didn't have anything to fight about at the end of the Cold War. We established conditions for nuclear peace. And then, because darkness does follow dawn, through terribly unwise decisions by both Washington and Moscow, we sloughed off key elements of the nuclear peace. They were inconvenient, unnecessary, and this was most unwise. And here we are 2 decades later, where the world is again extremely troubled and filled with nuclear danger. There's more nuclear danger now, believe it or not, than there was during the Cold War. And the reason why I assert this is because during the Cold War, there was only one pairing of nuclear armed rivals. Now there are 4. And Pakistan is in the middle of this. So one pairing, obviously, is Pakistan and India. Another one is India and China. And then, of course, there's the United States and Russia. That one hasn't gone away. And the United States and China. So the world is deeply troubled again through a series of bad decisions that I recount in this book. But I end the book looking to the future, and I remain doggedly optimistic. We can reclaim key elements of nuclear peace. We can rebuild what has been torn down. And Pakistan's going to have to be part of this. India, China will have to be part of this, as well as the United States and Russia. And I lay out some ideas that are very hard to do, but there are ways to reclaim nuclear peace. And I end the book on an optimistic note. What we're going to rebuild will have some very familiar elements to it, but there will be new elements as well. And that's where Pakistan and India come in.
That's great. Thank you so much for giving us an overview of the book. I know, many in Pakistan don't have access to the book yet and have not read it, but we'll get to it in time. I've reviewed your book. Thank you so much for sending it to me, and my review should come out this month, and we'll be sharing it widely as well. So I have a couple of questions for you, and then we will take questions from the audience as well. My first question to you, Michael, is that your seminal and voluminous account has established a very important linkage between deterrence and arms control, with each deriving strength from the other. So based on your experience and findings, how do you assess the future of the symbiotic connection between the two?
Thank you for that question. Deterrence strategists and arms controllers are forever fighting with each other, at least in my country. Everybody has the scars to prove it. And the deep irony is that we both need each other. Because arms control really can't succeed unless it is backstopped by deterrence. But deterrence is inherently dangerous. And it's supposed to be dangerous. Deterrence only works if you're conveying meaningful threats. And typically when states strengthen deterrence, they sharpen swords. They make the threats more pointed. And if you do deterrence without arms control, every increment of deterrence really, in my view, doesn't make you safer unless you have this arms control piece in place. And by arms control, I don't mean it has to be a treaty and there have to be numbers on the page and highly intrusive inspections. All of these things take time. But arms control is a much broader practice. It can involve tacit agreements, confidence and security and nuclear risk reduction measures. So there's some of that on the subcontinent, but seriously, there hasn't been meaningful work done in decades. So the two have to go together. And the arms control piece, in my view, has to be, it has to be made on the subcontinent. It can't be made in some foreign capital. It has to be something you're comfortable with and you're willing to do with your neighbors.
Fair enough. Deterrence is a tricky slope, and who would know better than you, having dealt with it all your life. I hope we just learn the right lessons here in South Asia. It's still not too late. So my second question to you is that, be it Thomas Schelling, Paul Nitze, or the Reagan-Gorbachev duo, arms control, as your book brilliantly dissects, has made headway on the shoulders of giants, individuals as well, right? So you say that you are optimistic. Are such individuals present, capable and willing today to make arms control a value as much as a virtue?
We have a real shortage of heroes nowadays. In all our countries. So if you are committed to the work of reducing nuclear danger, impatience doesn't help. perseverance does. And when we find ourselves in a domestic political situation, or a regional situation, or an international situation, geopolitical situation that is not conducive to progress, we don't go to sleep. We don't give up. We continue to think through how we can make things better. And every once in a while, we do have leaders that want to do better and have the domestic political backing to do better. And this conjunction of leaders, it can't be just one leader. It's got to be at least two. This conjunction of having leaders that really want to reduce nuclear danger and address the other problems that every country faces, it's rare. It's extremely rare. But the way to take advantage of that circumstance, that rare circumstance, is to be ready for it to happen. And in the United States and the Soviet Union, I mean, nobody, I mean, Reagan, Gorbachev, are you kidding me? Nobody expected that. And yet it happened. And nobody expected both of them to be deeply committed to avoiding Armageddon. They were, and they proved it. And I don't know where Pakistani politics will lead. I don't know where Indian politics will lead. I surely hope and pray that things will get better. And there will be opportunities. There's no shortage of deterrence. There is a tremendous shortage of diplomacy. That can restart.
That's what my next question to you is about, diplomacy. So your broad, comprehensive definition of arms control and analysis of the purple patch in history, it highlights the importance of diplomacy. Given all this, how do you look at the prospects of arms control at a time when diplomacy, dialogue, negotiations, all are giving way to the use and threat of use of force? And it is not only related to US-Russian relations or as to how the things are panning out with the trio, including China. It's also with Pakistan and India and other countries as well. So how would you analyze that? Does diplomacy have a future in arms control?
Oh, it has a future. And it has to have a future. And national leaders, they don't want to go anywhere near the nuclear threshold. I don't care what your nationality is, what your religion is. You have an obligation to the well-being of your people and to avoid cataclysm. So I have no doubt that diplomacy has a future. The question is, how can we be creative to open up channels of communication that are now clogged? And in this book, I propose something that I think people in Pakistan and India might even be receptive to. And that is, the P5 is so yesterday. And it's true that the P5 can continue to do useful things together. They've just recently come up with a statement reaffirming the Reagan-Gorbachev pledge that a nuclear war cannot be fought, can't be won, and must not be fought. And the more time that mantra is repeated, the better. But it's not enough. And I am proposing that we consider a forum where 7 countries sit around the table to talk about confidence and security and nuclear risk reduction building measures, to talk about lengthening and strengthening the norms we all live by, led by the norm of no use of nuclear weapons in warfare, now 7+ decades old. The norm of no testing, the norm of no further proliferation. And the 7 parties that I think belong at this table are the P5 plus India and Pakistan. So much of the dynamism of nuclear growth is in Asia right now. So I really do think it's useful to bring India and Pakistan in on these conversations. And there have to be ground rules, Rabia. And one ground rule, it seems to me, is you are prohibited from raising bilateral issues. It's a 7-nation forum. So you can't bring Kashmir into this. Afghanistan, I know it's such a terrible concern in Pakistan right now, but Afghanistan doesn't belong in this forum. It's only about how do we reduce nuclear danger. And if this forum works properly, and there's so many reasons why it might not, but if it works properly, there can be sidebar conversations between the United States and China, for example, between India and Pakistan, for example. We all have very specific problems. None of them are exactly alike, but the problems tend to be generic. And in some instances, it's possible to come up with ideas that are practical and implementable. And maybe this is one way to end this cold freeze between India and Pakistan, which serves nobody, but which is so hard to do, at least under current political circumstances. Maybe it will become easier. Maybe we can thaw it out a little faster if we have this 7-nation forum. It would confer status on Pakistan and India. It would acknowledge what's been done in terms of the nuclear question. But we got to move on a constructive track. And we got to bring China into it. It's so hard to bring China into it. And I think a 7-nation forum might be a way to get China more deeply involved.
I agree. I think it's a fascinating idea of P5+2. And it's about time that US and China also talk about arms control, and it's not only isolated. I also agree that, probably Kashmir could be put aside and not brought into the conversation of non-use, if that is the condition of bringing India on the table. But then similarly, other countries also need to, be more forthcoming to this as well, and not just make it a bilateral venue where they bring their baggages in. I like to move on because our audience also has some questions from you. So as you yourself recognize, the forces behind the arms control, success of arms control did not have to deal with the effects of emerging technologies, right? And now with emerging and disruptive technologies becoming a veritable reality, how should arms controllers adjust with a view of enabling arms control to stage a much needed comeback? How do you look at emerging technologies and arms control?
Rabia, one of the advantages of adopting a historical perspective is that the agenda items that seem so difficult today pale in importance when you consider how much harder the agenda items were previously. So for example, there are new emerging technologies. They're actually not new technologies, but this hypervelocity glide vehicle business, it's not new, but it's being weaponized, whereas before it wasn't. But we've been aware of this technology for quite some time. And indeed, an old-fashioned long-range ballistic missile gets the job done. I mean, it can get through. And it's pretty damn fast as well. So I view these technologies actually as being marginal. These are niche weapons for very specific targets, and you don't need much of them. And they're expensive. And it's way less expensive to do things the old-fashioned way. And they work, because missile defenses, no matter how much you spend on them, are no better today than they were decades ago. The technology of defense lags even further behind the technology of offense. So you don't really need that much more offense. I think we can manage these problems. I really do. But I don't think we can manage them numerically. It's certainly not in a multilateral context. So I propose that the focus of arms control, at least in the near term, not be on treaties, not be on numbers, but be on norms, and be on confidence, security, and nuclear risk reduction. I think if we focus on norms, lengthening and strengthening the norms we live by, and really focusing on ways to reduce dangerous military practices, I think that's the way to go.
Fair enough. I would like to push you a bit more on norms as well. So you've rightly advocated for strengthening the norms of non-proliferation, non-use, non-testing. However, we have witnessed, throughout history, how the makers of arms control and non-proliferation regimes are also responsible for their eviscerations, right? So with that in mind, what must be done to convince them to substantively bolster these norms? It is okay to ask for India and Pakistan to join, this, I wouldn't say bandwagon, very important platform where norms either, they don't need to be adopted as such from the Cold War model, but they need to be, internalized in their own psyches. How do we go about upholding these norms so that these countries, those the makers and those the followers, how do they get on and get this done?
Yeah, that's an impossibly hard question, Rabia. And you know it. Because the norm makers always have exceptions. And Pakistan has benefited by being an exceptional case. You wrote about this. And India has benefited from being an exceptional case. So imperfection intrudes on norm building. But I think we have to do it. We just have to do it. We have to, look, if the norm of no battlefield use is broken, the roof falls in. Because the whole dynamic of deterrence, and Pakistan's enmeshed in this, and it has company, where to deter, you think you need to seek advantage if you can, and certainly to avoid disadvantage. And those twin impulses also apply if you cross the nuclear threshold. You're going to seek advantage and you're going to seek to avoid disadvantage. And that makes escalation control not impossible, but extremely difficult. And if you don't do escalation control, then you're committing crimes against humanity and nature. So we've got to respect that nuclear threshold. We can't cross it. And I don't care if it's a low yield weapon. I don't care if you put a small charge on top of a Trident missile, or you have a tactical nuclear weapon on the ground. It doesn't matter. You cannot cross the nuclear threshold because so much damage can result. And if we don't stand behind that norm, we risk everything. So, yeah, there's hypocrisy involved. I get that. There are exceptions, but we've got to try to focus on norms.
I agree. The only, problem is you're right about hypocrisy. I don't know how Biden's NPR is going to turn out to be, but the one Trump presented, with low yield weapons and their battlefield use, what does it do to norms? The discussion around norms with such an NPR, opening ways for first strike against a cyber attack was just ridiculous. And imagine what signals it sends. But you're right, norm building is one thing. And then internalizing those norms, standing by those, it's extremely difficult. So I guess, one needs to have hope when it comes to norms. My last question to you, before I move to the audience, is that as someone who has invested time and energy and years in understanding the nuclear landscape in South Asia, what lessons should South Asian leaders take from this history if they are to give arms control a chance to make its way into our region?
One of the things I learned by showing up on the subcontinent is you don't tell other people what to do.
I don't get off that, Michael.
Listen, I hope you learn from our mistakes. I really do. Because we've made so many of them. And you can do better.
Okay, I will not push you further on this. That's okay. I would want the audience to please raise their hands. I've received 2 questions in the Q&A. So please either type your questions, raise your hands, and I will give you a chance to speak. I have a question from Seema Khan, who's a guest here. She says, hi, Professor Michael. My question to you about the reckless sale practices in India of nuclear and radioactive materials. Is America cognizant of this dangerous practice? And if so, what measures have been taken to contain illegal possession and sale of uranium in India? It's obviously, you must have followed related to the recent upsurge in the black market on the sale of uranium. So over to you, Michael.
You know, there's never enough nuclear safety and security, never enough. And one of the lessons I think we all learn is that you have to do better. You have to do better. And there have been instances, and at least published reports, of theft going back at least 15 years in India. And of course, there was great concern in Pakistan as well, especially after 9/11. But Pakistan took steps to get its house in order. I think India has taken a great many steps to get its house in order. These instances will occur, and you just have to keep working the problem.
All right, fair enough. We have a question from Mohammed Gulzaib. He writes that on the one hand, globe is negotiating over arms control and disarmament. On the other, states are working on hypersonic missiles and establishing dimensions for space wars. So in this atmosphere, can we really imagine that states are willing to agree upon arms control or non-proliferation agreements, going further?
Well, if your definition of agreements is treaties, then I would say no. This is not a great time to do treaties. Partly because the domestic politics in my own country are so dysfunctional that treaties cannot get a supermajority in the Senate under a Democratic president. But if you define arms control more broadly, as I've tried to do in this talk and in my book, then yes, I do think it's possible. But circumstances are really tough right now because 2 of the 3 biggest holders of nuclear arsenals have issues with the status quo. Arms control is way easier when everybody agrees to the status quo. And while the United States is comfortable with the status quo, Russia certainly isn't with respect to Ukraine. And China certainly isn't with respect to Taiwan or the South China Sea. And so we're looking at a situation where there's quite likely to be a continuation of dangerous military practices. And there are dangerous military practices surrounding disputed territory in the line of actual control and the line of control on both sides of the Indian state. So we're in a rough stretch right now. Treaties are not going to do it. And it will be hard enough even to do confidence, security, and nuclear risk reduction with states that are unhappy with the status quo. But we got to try.
Great. A question from Azam Dar. He says that you have written a nuclear peace cannot count only on deterrence or the instruments of reassurance, including arms control. To be extended, the nuclear peace requires embracing both. He wants you to elaborate on it as to how can both be embraced.
With extreme difficulty. Let me tell you, it is so hard. An early general who was in charge of our SAC, the warfighting outfit that's headquartered in Nebraska in the United States, the Strategic Air Command. This general was being pressed to agree to arms control measures while he was sending B-52s loaded with hydrogen bombs to fly over the Arctic every day. And he said, this is like dressing and undressing at the same time. And it's a legitimate complaint. I mean, because deterrence is about sharpening swords and arms control is about sheathing them. And it's so hard to do, in part because the domestic constituencies in support of deterrence are so much stronger than the domestic constituencies in support of arms control. In every single country that has nuclear weapons, it's an unequal fight. And that's where national leaders and wise military officers come in. They see the need to sheathe as well as sharpen. Because if you don't do both, you're only increasing nuclear risk.
Absolutely. And when this type of conversation happens, it reminds me of a joke, Michael, which is like, how do porcupines make love? And the answer is with much difficulty, So let there be hope. There's a question from one of our students, Aus Khan. She says that, why can't we all fall under the same roof? I mean, either all countries give up on their nuclear weapons or every country has it to fight back. This way, the weak and underdeveloped states won't have to feel insecure. And she adds on, don't you think NPT is unjust as it restricts non-nuclear states to refrain from development of nukes and allowing the official P5 legitimate nuclear states to keep theirs?
The world is unfair. There is no question. There is a decided shortage of justice and fairness in this world, in my country, in other countries. And so it's up to us to try and make the world a little bit fairer and a little bit more just. And poor countries that have tremendous societal needs will only become more unjust to their own people if they spend a lot of money on nuclear weapons. We throw money around like crazy in the United States. And we still have significant societal ills. And we still spend a lot of money on nuclear weapons. it's unjust. What I would urge you to think about is how, truly just solutions elude us. And so how do we do better? We got to do a little bit better. We got to leave this world in a little bit better shape than we left it. And over time, we can do surprisingly successful things if we attend to questions of justice. I like to think the United States has struggled with this more than any other country that has nuclear weapons. And we still have a long way to go.
Absolutely, a very long way to go for all of us, I guess. We have a guest, Umar. His question is that, how can we expect arms control where China and US are trapped in a Thucydides trap? AUKUS, where Australia and US have come together, is one example. How does one deal with this hypocrisy, in general? Norm building, norm legitimizing on one hand, and then pushing for your strategic interests and doing whatever it takes for it on the other.
Well, you don't do whatever it takes. There are certain things you don't do. Responsible states do not use chemical weapons against each other or against their own political opponents. Responsible states do not use biological weapons. We have conventions that prohibit these things. Responsible states do not commit crimes against humanity and nature by using nuclear weapons in warfare, whether or not they formally agree in their declaratory policies to no first use. They still don't use them. And they haven't for over 70 years. So not everything is on the table. Geopolitical competition is a fact of life. And the United States is competing with China because the United States has friends and allies in the Pacific and doesn't want to acknowledge Chinese hegemony in the Pacific. So we will contest that. But there are still rules of the competition. That's the way the system works, at least so far. And we can do business with China. We already do an extraordinary amount of business with China. We can compete in some areas with China, and we can cooperate with China. I think the key issue here is whether or not China's leader is absolutely intent on bringing Taiwan into the fold by any means necessary, including the use of force. If Xi Jinping believes that the use of force to secure Taiwan is absolutely necessary, then we really have problems ahead of us. But it's not clear to me that he's headed there. He seems to be a guy in a hurry, but that is so dangerous. I hope wisdom prevails.
Like I said, let there be hope. So I will, Michael, give the last question to our own atomic fireball, Syed Aliza Jafri, whom you have met while he was at Stimson.
Sure.
Yeah, so Ali says that you, Schelling, and fellow travelers rightly talk about reassurance being critical of to bolstering deterrence. Reassurance, in my opinion, likely to reduce as and when emerging technologies make their way in the strategic toolkits of nuclear states. So how do you look at emerging technologies in that particular context?
Ali, the emerging technologies that I worry most about are the ones I can't see and I don't understand. So I'm talking about cyber, artificial intelligence. I'm too old to understand these things. I can barely open my computer and work on it. But I worry a great deal about this. I worry less about technologies of space warfare, in part because I understand them more, and in part because I think deterrence is in play in space. It's easy to mess up satellites. It's so easy. It doesn't take emerging technologies to do this. Old-fashioned technologies can do this. But once you start, it's like using a nuclear weapon. Oh, it's only a tactical nuclear weapon. Don't worry about it. No. You start the ball rolling, and where do you stop? So the emerging technologies, hypervelocity glide vehicles, I mean, they're marginal compared to existing technologies to do extreme damage. The focus, the technologies that I worry the most about are the invisible ones. And I believe we're going to need codes of conduct to deal with them, but I can't begin, because of my lack of knowledge, to tell you what should be inside that code of conduct or how you monitor it.
Yeah, I think it's it's a very difficult question because strategic arms control happened when strategic parity happened. And so with emerging technologies, I think until and unless the powers who are racing with each other achieve that parity, we are not going to see arms control for emerging technologies. So let's see, it's a tricky slope. I just hope that Pakistan, India, and countries in our region don't fall into that trap. Otherwise, there was just no turning back from there. With this, Michael, I would like to thank you for your time. And I understand that it's pretty bad, severe weather at your end, and you have made your way, to a place to do this session with us. And I really am inspired by your commitment to the field, to the discipline, to the learning, and to your wisdom. I would also like to thank my audience for your questions, and Michael, for you to addressing all of them.
Rabia, you take care of yourself. I wish your family safety and good health.
Thank you so much, and Happy New Year. And let's be optimistic about all of this. Let's have hope about us. We have got nothing. Absolutely. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks for doing this. Take care.
Take care, Mike. Take care. Bye.